Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. Welcome to Your History, Your Story. Today our guest is Leora O'Carroll, an Emmy-nominated writer, producer, and accomplished musician. Leora is here to talk about the 2019 book she co-authored with her mother Maureen, titled Maureen O'Carroll, a musical memoir of an Irish immigrant childhood. The book shares the inspiring story of Leora's mother Maureen, who grew up in Australia as one of 10 children of Irish immigrant parents who had fled their homeland in the mid-1920s to escape possible reprisals due to their political activism. Guided by the values of her parents in a household filled with resilience, community, and a love of music, Maureen went on to become an acclaimed cellist, performing with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and other ensembles around the world. She was also a successful recording artist, soloist, and teacher. I'd now like to welcome Leora O'Carroll to our show. Welcome, Leora.
Thank you, James. A pleasure to be here.
I am so thrilled to be speaking to you about your book, Maureen O'Carroll, a musical memoir of an Irish immigrant childhood. I have the book right here. And of course, any book that has a picture of anyone playing a cello is automatically something I'm interested in. Not that I ever play the cello, but I love the music that comes from that instrument.
It is a gorgeous instrument, absolutely beautiful.
And the cello sort of plays throughout the whole story in my mind anyway when I hear this story because it's really fun. But I'd like to start off by asking you, could you give us sort of a summary as to what this book is about?
Sure. The book is about my mother, who is an acclaimed cellist, Maureen O'Carroll, growing up in a large Irish immigrant family during the Depression and World War II in Sydney, Australia. And in fact, all 10 children were musicians.
So 10 children, that's a story in and of itself, for sure.
Yeah, I think, during the Depression, that era, especially Irish families had very large, they had large families. And sadly, I think one of the reasons, besides obviously lack of birth control, was because, there were so many severe illnesses in those days, and often some of the children would die in childhood. But that fortunately did not happen with the O'Carroll children.
Yeah, another thing that sort of pulled me into the story was that I have Irish roots in my family as well. My grandfather came from a really large family. There were 9. He was one of 9, not quite as much as your mom was, but almost.
Close.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I can't imagine. I have 3 children. They're all grown now, of course, but the thoughts of having 10 children and what they're up to and all the different things that pop up during, day-to-day life is incredible. So it's a really fascinating story, not just about the times that your mother and her parents lived in, but also the personalities that had to sort of come together and make it all work out in some way or another. But I'd like to start off with, you start off in Ireland. Well, you sort of go back into a flashback. You start off at one point, but then you go back to sort of talk about the Irish roots of your mom's family. And one of the people who's a really interesting character is your grandmother, May. Can you tell us about her?
Yes, Megan. She was a feisty, feisty woman. She was a dancer and she danced with the Abbey Theatre. And through that, she was recruited to join the Women's Army in Ireland before the 1916 Rising. And because she was a dancer, she was a really fast runner and she was a messenger and she would carry messages from one location of the Rising to another, such as St. Stephen's Green, the Imperial Hotel, to the General Post Office. She was eventually caught and imprisoned in Kilmainham jail with a number of other women. She remained, when she was released, very politically active, and she was imprisoned again during the Civil War. And in fact, that was in 1923. And during that imprisonment, she participated, along with a number of other women, in a hunger strike. And that was to protest the treatment of another prisoner who desperately needed medical treatment and wasn't receiving it. And she, in fact, went on a hunger strike for 16 days, which just boggles my mind. I can't imagine that. So she was a very feisty woman, very patriotic to Ireland and tough. She had to survive a lot.
Now, this army you talk about, this was the Irish Citizen Army? Is that what it was called?
This is the women's branch of the Irish Citizens Army.
Yeah, so you talk about the risk involved there. You said she was very feisty, she was very agile, she was able to literally run fast. Do you know what it was about her background that made her so patriotic?
That's a good question. I think it was just growing up in a very, very tough circumstances. She knew growing up what it was like not to have food, and her father was a builder and fell off a roof working on the Dublin hospital when he was quite young. So money was extremely tight, and she recalls being put to bed during the day with her brothers and sisters because her mother didn't have enough food to feed them and didn't have any fuel to heat where they lived. And so she wanted to conserve their energy. So it was a very, very tough childhood. And I think she understood how important it was for Ireland to break free from British rule and gain its own independence.
Yeah, and I had a note that I wrote down after I read the book that she was born in 1899, so right at the turn of the century.
That's right. And of course, she was very young when she participated in the 1916 Rising. But of course, when you're that young, that makes you more daring also.
I'll say when you think of what the world was like back at that time, because you had World War One that was taking a terrible toll on Europe, and then you had the uprising in Ireland. So, and of course, you have young people involved in the uprising. You have young people involved in the war. So there was just a lot going on. But it sounds like she really knew what was going on and wanted to be involved in it.
Yes, she had four brothers, and they were also very politically involved. And matter of fact, she met my grandfather through her brothers. They brought home this young recruit, John O'Carroll. So the family, the Gann family, was very engaged.
Mhm. Let's talk about John O'Carroll. So, what about him? Tell us about his story.
Uh, his family was plagued by tragedy. He actually grew up in middle class comfort. His family owned some butcher shops, and he had a younger sister who died when a nursemaid dropped her. His mother died in childbirth. His father then apparently grieved to death. So by age 6, he was an orphan, and he had three older siblings, two sisters and a brother. He was, in fact, sent to an orphanage in England, which I can only imagine was quite brutal and Dickensian. And his sisters were then shipped off to help out on a sheep station in the outback of Australia. Before they left, they saw their brother and tried to reassure him that they would come back tomorrow. But of course, they were off to Australia, and he used to ask the nuns every day, "Is it tomorrow yet?" So he had a very, very tragic childhood, but he had tremendous spirit and tremendous optimism. He overcame all that. He was finally sent back to Ireland to live with cousins. And he too was feisty and spirited, and his glass was always half full. And he was quite a remarkable man and had great vision. And later in his life, when he ran for political office in Australia, there's an ad in the newspaper that he was the anti-Nazi candidate, and this was in 1933. So he was also incredibly tuned into the world and knew what was going on everywhere, and a very astute man.
If there was any reason for somebody to have a bad attitude, to really just want to withdraw from life, or to just give up and let somebody else run things. He had every reason going, didn't he?
He did, but he was an optimist and he chose to live his life to the fullest. And he had 10 children that he was incredibly proud of. He was very entrepreneurial. And, of course, one of our favorite recollections from the book is he ran a barber shop called the Anchor Hairdressing Salon in Sydney. And at the back of the barber shop was a so-called lending library where the men would come in bringing these books. But in fact, it was a front for horse race betting, and they would carry their bets inside the books. Word got out finally to the police, and they tried to arrest my grandfather, but they couldn't because he very cleverly kept the books in Gaelic. And of course, they couldn't translate Gaelic. So he was a character for sure.
He was a genius. I think when you hear about these all sorts of these master class things or TED Talks and those things. I think your grandfather could have been a great candidate to give one of those because he had been through it all, and yet he had this amazing entrepreneurial spirit. What he could have passed on to others, I bet. Well, he certainly the personality. He must have had a huge impact on all of his children. But you mentioned Australia, so we're in Ireland right now. How do we get to Australia?
Well, by 1925, my grandparents had grown. Well, first of all, they invested their entire youth in fighting for the independence of Ireland from British rule. They were exhausted. They had both been imprisoned at various times, and my grandmother also was beginning to have health problems and also very concerned, waiting for that knock at the door because of all their political activity. And so at that point, they decided to leave Ireland. And they left Ireland with their two eldest children and May's parents and her brothers, Robert and John. They first went to New Zealand and they found New Zealand, I think, quite isolating and tough. There was not a Catholic community there. May's mother died at age 51 from peritonitis, and they had learned that there was a much bigger Catholic community in Sydney, Australia. So May's father and his eldest son Robert actually went back to Ireland, and then, excuse me, May and John O'Carroll and their two eldest children, and then they also had Kathleen, the next child in New Zealand, plus May's younger brother John, decided to immigrate to Sydney, Australia, and they arrived there in 1930 in the throes of the Depression.
Oh boy. Now, your mom was born not long after that, I think 1932 or something like that. So your mom was actually born in Australia.
That's correct. And in fact, they had another girl in between, Patricia. And so the family was growing quite large already. And they settled in a blue-collar working class area of Sydney called Balmain. And that is where my grandfather and my uncle opened the Anchor hairdressing salon.
That sounded like a great place. They were earning money in all sorts of ways and probably became a big part of the community. But I'm just thinking about the spirit of upping and moving from Ireland, the country that they had been fighting for battling for, and getting to the point where they were sort of felt forced to leave it. That must have been sort of gut wrenching, not only logistically because you're moving children and other family members, but also emotionally to leave Ireland, the country that they loved. Was there much that your family and family lore stories that dealt with the pain of leaving Ireland?
I haven't heard directly about that pain, but you can imagine you're right. It would have been gut-wrenching. They had to leave family behind. And then, of course, when they went from New Zealand to Australia, the rest of the family that had survived went back to Ireland. And, in those days, everything was very final. You didn't get to fly back and see your family. And the financial burden of trying to move your family to one country at the bottom of the earth, especially in those days, New Zealand, and then Australia, was really profound. So I think anyone whose family has experienced that immigration knows how incredibly tough it was on everyone.
Oh, for sure. And I think about with your grandfather and your grandmother, it's not that both of them had this easygoing life. They were so comfortable. There was no stress or strain. They both had incredibly difficult, challenging, in some ways exciting youths. And so I guess there could have been then that sense of adventure in them as well, would you say?
I'm sure there was a sense of adventure because I think it's only that sense that would give you the courage to do what you did and to risk your lives and to suffer the imprisonment, to suffer torture. And they obviously, of course, so firmly believed in Ireland being free.
Hmm. Do you think there was ever a thought that someday they would return to Ireland?
I've never actually heard that referenced. I think what happened was when they settled in Sydney, then they eventually had 10 children, and they were so ensconced in the community there, and all their children were so, active as musicians even when they were children. And my grandfather sort of had a thumb in every pie and was very politically engaged. So I and things were still very tough in Ireland, so I don't think they necessarily engaged the idea of going back.
Hmm. But they were still firmly attached to their Irish roots, and they were very proud of their Irish roots, right?
Very much so. The children growing up, my mother didn't realize growing up that they used to sing a lot at night, and every song she was taught were, Irish nationalism songs. And my grandfather had in their living room all these portraits of their Irish heroes. And in fact, the boys were all named after Irish martyrs. And my eldest aunt, Eileen, was named after Countess Markovich, Eileen Markovich, who was very active in the 1916 rising. So they were very pro-Irish. And every Easter, they would go to the Waverley Cemetery and honor those who had sacrificed their lives to fight for Ireland.
If you don't mind, I remember one part of your book where your mom was going to have a young man come over to take her out, I think on a date, and she tried to take down all your grandfather's portraits of all the heroes.
Yes, and in fact, when her older sister Kathleen was going to bring a young man home, she asked Maureen to please, please take down the portraits before we enter before we come home and enter the living room. And she'd done so, and she hid them all behind the sofa. And then when they were sitting having tea in the living room, Kathleen and her young man, their father marched in and he was a blustery man and said, where are my Irish heroes? And so he busily rehung them all in the middle of this date.
So it was Kathleen. Yeah, so there is another. So let's get back to the picture of your mom playing the cello on the front cover of the book. Tell us about this musical gift that seemed to flow through the family.
Well, funnily enough, which certainly wouldn't be the case today, in that era, my grandparents clearly recognized the musical talent within the children, but they also saw music as a way out of their tough circumstances, and as a way to earn decent money that no parent today would encourage their child to be a musician as a path out of tough circumstances, but certainly they did then, and that was exactly right. That did elevate the kids and give them opportunities that the parents never had. And they played in various symphony orchestras around the world. A lot of them had really tremendous musical careers. So there was that talent that flowed through the children. And my eldest uncle and aunt, Robert and Eileen, played the violin and the harp. And then the next two children, Kathleen and Patricia, played the violin and the harp as well. But my mother, for some reason, was fixated on the cello. And she used to, when she was a little girl, steal her older brother's violin from under the bed and prop it up on a big jam tin and pretend to play the cello. And so finally, at age 6, her father, in fact, got her first cello, a quarter-sized cello. So it's a funny thing that, one instrument can speak to a child and they know that that is the instrument they're destined to play.
They not only played, but they played magnificently. I mean, your mom, for instance, it was recognized pretty early on that she was she was very gifted. If you could just expand on a little bit, I know she wasn't able to continue at a school for a while, so she was being taught by I think it was a nun at school, and the nun had never really played the cello. And how did that affect her?
Yes, yeah, that's funny. She started off studying at the Conservatorium of Music in Sydney when she was 6 years old, but she believes her parents just didn't have enough money to continue paying for the fees at the conservatorium. So the local convent claimed to teach music lessons for a nominal fee. So she was sent there instead, but we're quite convinced the nun had no clue how to play the cello. And when she saw my mother playing the cello, she was absolutely appalled that she'd be straddling this instrument and insisted she play side saddle with her legs crossed over to one side because that was much more ladylike. So from that point, moving forward at the convent, the nun would hum various hymns, and my mother would play them by ear on the cello in this very awkward fashion. And that was the extent of her lessons. Fortunately, my grandmother found the money to apparently send her back to the conservatorium and rescue her from very misguided instruction and get her back with proper instruction with a teacher at the conservatorium.
So your grandfather, did he also play instruments?
He sang and he played the piano just a little bit. Neither grandparent was very, they didn't really play a string instrument or anything, but they did like to sing. And of course, the Irish are just, I think, innately musical and do love to sing.
Yeah, I just got the sense that they were just so interested in seeing their children go forward. You mentioned it for economic reasons then, but I understand also that they might have even been excused from doing chores or other things as long as they were practicing.
Yes, my grandfather really ran the household, and he used to have these massive cleaning furies where they'd move all the furniture out of the house and lift every rug, and they'd have to scrub every pot in the kitchen. And so the kids got cluey that if they said they had to go practice, they got out of those cleaning events. So yes, they caught on quickly that practicing would trump any other chore in the house.
So as I'm reading the story and I'm feeling like I'm being immersed in this family, this large family, and the parents were people who had incredible stories to tell and a lot of energy and a lot of hopes and dreams and politically active and socially active and entrepreneurial and all those things. It sounds almost exhausting to me to be part of that family. Do you think it was?
I think it would be exhausting to be any part of family that has 10 children. And I agree with you. I'm sure it was exhausting. I think the parents were extraordinarily energetic. My grandfather did not allow any of the kids to sleep past 6 a.m., and he would blast the gramophone in the morning to get them up. And certainly they instilled in them a very strong work ethic. I think everyone worked very hard, and the children, on top of doing normal academics, also had to devote a lot of time to their music. But I do think any large family, I think, can be very, very hard. I mean, for instance, the girls all shared one bed together. And if one of them wanted to turn over, they'd have to sort of cue the other two girls that were now going to turn over. And, money was always very tight. And of course, my mother, being the youngest of the girls, would always get these hand-me-downs that had gone through many versions of the same dress. And so I think it was, yes, genuinely stressful.
So this store, the Anchor, so this was a source of income, and it sounds like this was a place where a lot of people probably came to, sort of congregate and talk and things like that. It sounds to me also that your grandfather was always on the lookout for a way to continue to earn money. And there was a time actually during, I think, World War II when Americans started to show up in
Yes.
Australia. Tell us about that and how did your grandfather react to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, yes, the Anchor Hairdressing Salon was definitely the hub of Balmain, and it was sounds like a very vibrant, colorful place. But when the American soldiers turned up, at that point they were running a shop. They had moved from the Anchor Hairdressing Salon to what they called the Ship, which was in fact the identical building next door, but it had a little grocery store instead of a hairdressing salon because they thought that was a better way to earn money during the war because my grandfather and my great uncle were away in the war at various points. And one time when my grandfather was home, when the first American soldiers arrived, the very first thing he did was go up to them and ask them, "What do Americans like to eat?" And they told him hot dogs. So he immediately put out a sign out front that we serve hot dogs. And I'm sure they were unlike any American hot dog. And I'm sure he didn't have ketchup or American mustard, but I think the Americans appreciated the effort, and certainly he got business that way.
It's called pivoting, I think. He pivoted.
Yeah, exactly.
He's always thinking. He also had. I know we're bouncing around a little bit about your grandfather, and I want to get back to May in a second here, but
Sure.
it sounded to me like sometimes he would get into a little bit of an argument with when the kids were little with the Catholic priest, and then they'd be buddies one minute, next minute they'd be fighting, and he would take the kids out of Catholic school and put them in public.
Very much so. In Belmaine, the Catholic school, St. Augustine's, was directly across from the public school. And the public kids actually used to taunt the Catholic children because there was just a narrow lane between the two schools from in the schoolyards. But, my grandfather wasn't above using his children as a political pawn. And if he got into some big political argument with the priest and things didn't go the way he wanted, he would pull all his children out of the Catholic school and then put them in the public school until the priest made up to John, and then they would put them back in the Catholic school. And of course, both schools did appreciate this army of O'Carroll children because they were all really good students, but they also had that added dimension of bringing music to the school. So they were an asset, and certainly their father saw it that way.
That's wonderful. And I think your mom, if I'm doing the math right, so by the end of the Depression, she was about 7 years old, 8 years old. So she had the older siblings, and everybody was sort of they were really adding to the community at that time, right?
Yes, very much so. And of course, that's when World War II was starting. But, being in Australia and they weren't fortunately directly affected by the war in terms of any tragedies in their family, it was, we talk about World War II a lot in the book, and it was for these children in many ways an adventure. So,
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about the fact that your grandfather and your grandmother were managing all these children, and then your grandfather actually goes away to war, and his brother-in-law, right? I think May's brother also went into the war. So he was the barber, wasn't he? The primary hairdresser guy.
yes, Uncle John, the barber, he went away to fight in the war. My grandfather would have been too old to fight in the war, so he was actually assigned to be a cook. And his usual inventiveness, he was very conscious that the soldiers didn't like powdered eggs in the morning for breakfast. And they used to always have one of the soldiers duck his head into the kitchen to see, if they were having powdered eggs. And if they did, they would avoid it. So my grandfather creatively collected this large carton of eggshells. And every morning when he would cook eggs for the soldiers, he would spread out the eggshells on the counter so that when one of the soldiers popped his head in, he could then tell the other soldiers, "Hey, we're having real eggs." So, he was always very creative, and it's a little story, but I certainly love that story.
I remember my mom telling me when she was in England during the war that the powdered eggs were, terrible, and, the rationing was really bad. And sometimes when they got real eggs, they were almost green and they smelled, and things were
Oh,
pretty bad. We're in the United States here. We're blessed in many ways that, when you hear about what the hardships people went through. But I'm thinking about your great uncle, guys, I guess it was, and your grandfather being away, even when your grandfather was away just for a little while, that May had to really handle everything when he was away. What an incredible woman. I can't fathom she had to keep the income going and take care of all these kids. I mean, what did she draw from?
well, I think it suited her. She was a very social person, and she was very creative. and industrious. And I think she kind of enjoyed not having her husband there and him dominating everything. The children are now older. They can help her in this shop. And so I think, and she also got the sort of unique experience of just spending time alone with the children and the children learning more about who their mother was and learning more about her youth and her activities in Ireland. One of the stories she told them during that period was once she had to carry munitions in a Gladstone bag from Dublin to an outlying area in Ireland. And when she got off the train, there were all these British soldiers there inspecting bags. And of course, she had this very heavy bag full of munitions. And suddenly she spotted an Irish officer that she knew. And so she went up to him and made a big fuss of him. And he escorted her through the checkpoint and offered to carry her bags. And May, this is so heavy. What's in it? And she goes, oh, it's all these jars of jam for me, ma'am. So, those stories were it was an opportunity for my grandmother to spend time with her children and tell a little bit more about her youth and who she was.
The book is just filled with so many stories, but if I could just land on this one, there's a time when I think some of your mother's siblings were in the hospital. Your mother had a lot more of your grandfather's attention, and she almost liked the fact that even though they were in the hospital, they weren't there to take his attention away from her.
Yeah, that was a really extraordinary situation where, so there were two much older children, and then there were eight younger children, and all her younger siblings, seven of them, came down with diphtheria. And remarkably, my mother, who was always this very healthy child, didn't get diphtheria. So the other children were all sent away to an isolation hospital in Botany Bay. And my mother suddenly became an only child, something she had always dreamt of being. So she was young, very young. I think, she was like 8. And she was suddenly indulged by 4 adults at home, her parents and her older brother and sister. And, she could have second helpings at dinner and she could help herself to her sister's clothing without having to ask their permission. And they sort of doted on her because there was the distinct possibility that the other 7 children may not survive diphtheria. So she actually, frankly, relished that time with her parents and her older brother and sister, and only only saw the upside of it. Let's put it that way.
I love the honesty there. I really do. I'm one of two, and my brother's 6.5 years older. So a lot of my time I was an only child. And in fact, when he went away to school, so I was able to get my parents' full attention. But she had to really, you had to really vie for their attention to get any. So I get the way she felt. The other thing is, I really love this moment where your grandmother they had to move for different reasons, but your mom was busy with her lessons and school, and your grandmother was very busy too, and she was missing a lot of her friends and everything like that. But there was a point where your mom got home, and she was still, I don't know, she was a teenager or a youngster.
Yes.
She enjoyed a cup of tea with her mom, and they sat, and I guess your grandmother warmed up dinner for her, and they sat and talked, and it just felt like cozy that your mom must have loved that, and your grandmother.
I think so. And when you have 10 children, there's so little opportunities to sort of sit one-on-one with your parent. And just through different circumstances, as I think my mother was 17 at the time, and I think she did have that precious moment of just sitting down and having a hot cup of tea with her mother, not necessarily saying anything, but just experiencing that warmth of the two of them together.
I remember my mom with the comforting words she would say at the end of a long day, or if it had been a rough day for me in any way, and she'd say, "I'm going to put the kettle on." And it just seemed like, I don't know, sort of a warm and toasty, and it must have been a wonderful connection for your mom, given how many brothers and sisters she had, and getting your grandmother's attention. That must have been a lovely moment.
I think so. I mean, I think the tea is a cure-all for everything in any Irish or Australian household and so many households around the world. And I think it must have been a very precious moment to have one-on-one time with your mother when she had 10 children and just be able to sit together and have a cup of tea together.
Yeah, but let me ask you about you. You're Maureen's daughter, and you also have musical gifts that came through your family. Tell us about you and how your mom and her immigrant roots have impacted you.
Yeah, well, I was essentially raised only by my mother because my parents divorced when I was very young. So, we had an immigrant parent, and I think that definitely makes you look at everything differently. And certainly there are elements of growing up that definitely came through from her childhood. One was she hated to waste food. And if there was leftover rice in the fridge, she'd make rice pudding. If there was leftover bread, there'd be bread pudding. And, that was clear from her childhood that, she didn't want to see food thrown away. I think by the same token, because in many ways it was tough growing up, one of 10 children, there were things I think she did with her own children to make sure it wasn't the same experience. For instance, our own possessions were ours, and our siblings didn't get to take them or have access to them without our permission, which is not what happened in her very crowded, hectic household. So I think she was very mindful of things like that. She would always emphasize growing up, there's always people that are better off than you and worse off than you. And, she always taught us from as young as I can remember to have compassion and empathy for those that are worse off than you or that are struggling. She would always point out that person's point of view and what it must be like for them. And that's one of the things I think she taught us most is compassion and understanding the experience of others.
That's wonderful. And she saw it rolling out in front of her for sure. Absolutely. What about the music though? So your mom was gifted. She came from a family that encouraged music. Is this something that you just fell in love with yourself, or did your mother sort of kind of push you toward it a little bit?
Well, when I was very young and my parents were married at that point, my father was also a cellist. And I cannot remember a time in our household where there wasn't music. And I remember, early in the morning waking up and hearing somebody practicing. And because both my parents played the cello, and of course, you want to do what your parents do, by age 3, I insisted that I also wanted to play the cello. But I was way too small for a cello. So they, in fact, got a viola and had an instrument maker put an end pen in it so I could play the cello. At that point in time, my dad was teaching at a university, and my mother would practice every morning with a pianist. And so I would sit next to her, and if you put soap on a bow, it doesn't produce a sound. So she would put soap on my bow, so I wasn't interfering with her practicing, but I thought I was contributing. And then I would sit next to my mother and play my little mini cello next to her because I wanted to be just like her. So music was something in our lives from the very beginning. I very much wanted to learn music. I learned how to read music before I learned how to read. And then I started piano lessons at age 5. And likewise, my siblings, learned music from a very young age, mainly because we wanted to.
I love that. That's something I really wished that I had pursued was to gain some sort of proficiency in a musical instrument. I played the trombone when I was in fourth grade, and uh, trombone doesn't, to me anyway, didn't seem like something you could just like to relax at night. You just took out the trombone and started playing it,
Wake up the neighbors.
But I do think about a guitar or a piano. So when I was in my 30s, my wife decided to get me piano lessons, and I actually took them for 2 or 3 years. I took piano lessons, and she actually at one point got me a piano. It was
Oh, nice.
secondhand, but it was a bit nice. It was a nice secondhand piano, and I just didn't keep up with the practicing, so I never got really good at it, and I never really got totally proficient at it. But I did enjoy learning how to play music, how to read music a little bit. But it's something that, oh gosh, if I had to do over again, I think I would just sort of channel myself into being more disciplined. It must take a lot of discipline, doesn't it?
Well, I had the incredible advantage of having parents who are musicians, and I think obviously that makes a huge difference because, and also being introduced to music at such a young age when you have the time to learn the instrument. And, and the other thing is they can help with your practicing, which if parents don't play music, they can't. So I did have those enormous advantages. But growing up, my mother always would say to us that, you don't have to be a professional musician, but I want you to be able to play an instrument so that if you choose to be a professional musician, you have that option. Or, in your teen years, you can play music gigs instead of flipping hamburgers and be paid 5 times as much. And that was very true. I started playing music gigs by age 15. And I always remembered that, like, I didn't ever have to waitress or flip hamburgers because I could play the violin and the viola and be hired to play in a string quartet. So, that always stuck with me. And certainly, even though my main career was in television, throughout my life, I've played at various times professionally and have always been so grateful that I, had that exposure as a very young child.
Does it still give you a lot of joy to play?
It does. As I got older, I also really loved teaching. And at one point, we lived on the island of Jamaica and I launched my own music camp there. And one of the themes for me was that music is a unifying force. The campers came from vastly diverse backgrounds. And I would fundraise each year so that more than half the campers who came from extremely tough circumstances could also attend the music camp on full scholarship. And for me, it would harken back to my mother and that how music was their path out of tough circumstances to better opportunities. And certainly I would tell my campers, maybe you don't want to become a professional musician, but music might be the opportunity for you to get college scholarship or, a paying gig. And I would certainly emphasize that to my young campers the way my mother emphasized it to us.
Your mother's influence, how did that help you in the other side of your career, the television part of your career?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, I just think she too taught us work ethic, a very strong work ethic, and being very detailed oriented, being very organized. And I am innately persistent. And that certainly helps in television production and certainly in writing and interviewing people or trying to nab a certain person you want to interview. At one point, I was producing a history of the 20th century, and my dream host was Walter Cronkite. And I really persisted, and I edited all sorts of trailers to send him to show him the example of the work that he'd be narrating. And even though we couldn't pay him that much, he finally agreed to it. And I really felt like a lot of that had to do with not giving up and pursuing a goal and making sure that everything was super well organized and all the details were there to present so that he could then agree to do it. And it works. So I think in very sort of discreet ways, her influence on me has affected every element of my life.
I think that's wonderful. It's like if you hit a little bit of a wall, you as your grandfather pivoted, you use another way to get around to really move in the direction that you're led to be. So did you actually you interviewed Walter Cronkite?
I directed him and he hosted the series on the 20th century, and I wrote his script. So
Wow, that is fantastic. I mean, Walter Cronkite, me growing up, I mean, he was the face on the TV all the time. I mean,
exactly. Yes, and for me, he would be the quintessential voice of the 20th century. If somebody's going to narrate a history of the 20th century, it's Walter Cronkite.
oh, absolutely. I mean, he was there for, I mean, from I guess World War II right through gosh, and I don't know what year he passed away, but the whole thing with the Kennedy assassination, Vietnam War, and all that, it was always him on there, and he was like a fatherly person that you could approach. But I'm glad you did that. That's wonderful. This book that you've written, the Maureen O'Carroll story, it's really your mom's memoirs, but you put it together and you turned it into a book. What did that mean to you?
Well, just going back to my own childhood, the Irish have the gift of the gab. And growing up in the United States, my mother would tell us stories of her growing up in this large Irish immigrant family in the Depression and World War II at the other end of the earth in Australia. So it was fascinating to me. It was exotic and just extraordinary information. And I was really intrigued from a very little girl. And I will tell you, even when I was that young, I remember thinking, we really need to write this down and capture these stories. So it stuck with me. And when I was working in New York as a freelance TV producer, at one point I remember just thinking, you know what, if I don't sit down with my mom side by side and get these stories down, it's never going to happen. And so at the point she was living in Seattle, and I said, I want to come out to Seattle and I really wants to finally write this book because we had spoken about it at various times. And I think that's often what happens in families like, oh, I want to get my memoirs down, and then it doesn't happen. And you can understand why, because our most precious commodity is time, and you have to have the time to set aside and structure a schedule and do it. And so I just decided, because I was a freelancer, I did have a little freedom to carve out a few months and go to Seattle and work with my mother. So that's what I finally did. And I pinned her down. I said, let's do it. So we sat side by side and sketched out the outline and how we wanted, which stories we wanted to tell. And of course, try to organize the chronology as much as we could. And then my aunt Kathleen, who at the time she'd been a violinist in the Philadelphia Orchestra, and she came and visited us. And because she was older, it was a great opportunity for me to also interview her and verify some of the information. So that was also incredibly valuable to me. I will never ever regret that experience and having done that. It is a transformational experience to write a memoir with a family member. And I have encountered so many people that regretted not doing that when when that person was still alive. And so, I'm forever grateful I did that. Of course, it gives so much more meaning to who your mother is and why she did things certain ways or how she raised you. There are so many boons from doing it. Another fantastic outcome of writing this book is, my mother was one of 10 children. I had a lot of cousins I didn't really know because so much of my life had been in the United States. And through the book, I got to know all sorts of cousins. It's just like a gift that keeps on giving.
That is terrific. Your history, your story is the name of our podcast. And when my wife and I kicked this off back in 2020, we were trying to think of what's our goal, what's our mission here. And it's really to get people to tell stories because I think it's a lost art sometimes. Well, with emails and all things like that, you don't have the personal memoirs that people had diaries and wrote letters that they saved. And sometimes we're at such a fast pace, or maybe we'd rather look at our phone or watch TV than to sit down and start talking to our kids and our grandkids and telling them how it was, way back in the 60s and the 70s for us, or for me anyway. But then to hear about your mom's stories going back to the 30s and 40s and 50s and even going back further with May and John, it's so cool. So the way you just phrased that to our listeners was, I couldn't think of a better way to phrase the importance of doing what you did, to write down the stories that came from your loved ones that now generations will have to reflect on. And it tells not only personal histories, but it tells national histories and local histories as well at the same time, doesn't it?
It does, James. And, thank you for that comment. And, I think it's so fantastic that you're doing this podcast because, first of all, there's no such thing as a boring family history, right?
Not at all.
And the more we can capture those stories, the more we learn about ourselves. And, that impacts all our futures too, where we're coming from. And it is so valuable. It is such a resource. It is such an asset to everybody when we do document those family experiences.
Well, this has been a delightful conversation. I'm so thankful that we were able to get in touch with you and talk about your book, Maureen O'Carroll, A Musical Memoir of an Irish Immigrant Childhood. Leora, this has been a lot of fun. What's next for you?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, this summer, I've been invited by the Milwaukee Irish Fest, which is the largest Irish festival in North America, to come to their festival as a guest author for our book. Our book had been selected for Irish Central's Ultimate Irish Reading List. And so I was very flattered that they invited me out. And I'm also going to be giving a talk at the festival about working with a family member on that memoir. Because there's so many people out there that want to do it, but they're really not sure where to start. So I'm really looking forward to that event.
Oh, that's fantastic. I wish you all the best. And I'm sure so many of your cousins, and you've got many,
Yes.
are thankful that you did this. And, maybe generations to come will be inspired by it, because you've done a lot of work. I mean, you sat your mom down and got these stories, and then you sort of verified them and got more stories from your aunt and everything like that. It's great. And, you've inspired me. I've got some regrets of questions I wished I had asked. And I asked a lot more than most, I think, do, because I love history. But I'll come across something and say, oh, I wish I knew that. Just one little piece. If I just asked, and I'm sure they probably told those stories in front of me and I don't remember, but you did a wonderful job. And Leora, is there any way people can find out more about your book, how they can order it, get a hold of it?
Yes, the book is available on Amazon, and we do have a website, MaureenO'Carroll.com, no apostrophe. And we also give history of my grandmother, Megan, on the website as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. But again, thank you. All the best to you. And I hope people go out and get this book and it'll inspire them, in effect, to start to remember and tell stories about their family history as well.
Well, thank you, James. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you, whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.